Okay, so we have our form, and we said that because forms are using different inputs, we want to set different minimum and maximum value for these inputs. Because we're using the same component, the only way we can do that is by passing in options for when we're calling a component function. So this is how we do it. We basically pass in opts1. We can call this however we want, but this is just how I call it here. So we will create opts1, and this is going to be an object with the key minimum, which will be set to 1 for the age, and maximum, which will be set to, let's say, 150. And for opt2, which is the year of birth, we can say the maximum would be the current year, and the minimum would be 2022 minus 150, if this is what we want. So it's 1872. 1872. So this is going to be min and max values for each of these input integer components. So let's see now, when the component receives these opts, what happens? We first have to deconstruct it. So we say const min and const max are created from opts. So this is deconstructing the object, which is the opposite of constructing it. Here we define it, we construct it. So we say object opts equals, and then curly braces, minimum is this, maximum is this. And when we deconstruct it, we just say, okay, inside of the opts object, there is min and max. Let's create two new variables and read them from opts. And then we set input min to min and input max to max, which literally means opts.min and opts.max. But because we deconstructed it, we have the values available here, so we can just say min. Or we could say opts.min, it would be the same. Okay, so now we have this, and it should work. So let's see. Oh, it works with arrows, but it still doesn't work if we try to type it, because we also have to adapt this function below. So we have to update handle on key up function. First, we can remove this console log. We don't need it anymore. And the second thing is we are here comparing if value, so the thing that we input, that we typed in, is bigger than input max. We can now just compare it to max, because if you remember, input.min is min and input.max is max, so we can use just min and max to make it shorter. And then we set input value to max. We don't have to hard code it to 0 and 150, because we want it to be depending on whatever we passed in as option. So we check if value is bigger than max, then set input value to max, and if value is smaller than min, then set input value to min. There's additional thing. Handle on key up doesn't have access to min and max, so we will need them, and we need to pass them from where this function is called. It's called inside of input integer, and input integer has access to min and max, so we can just pass it in as parameters. Okay, so now if we try, min and max are, this is 150, and this one is 2022. And minimum is 1875, 72, and 1. Okay, so this works. So now we only have to make it work for when we type the numbers. So currently, for the second input field, the minimum year is 1872. And if I type a 1, it checks, is 1 smaller than 1872? Yes. Okay, then set it to 1872. Just ignore whatever the person typed. But we don't want this. We would like to allow that the person types 4 numbers, and then we will check if these numbers are smaller or bigger than the minimum. So how do we do this? First of all, we want to figure out how many letters, how many characters did a user type. So for example, if we have a number 1872, and we want to say a dot length, it says, I don't know the length of number. But there is a trick. If we transform a to string, so if we transform number to string, we get basically a string out of this number. And then we can check what is the length, because the string, GTH, the string has this method with which we can check how many characters are in the string. So this is what we will do. We will define a length for value. So we will take the value number and say to string, which is honestly e.target.value was a string, and we had to transform it into a number because we are comparing numbers here. But now for the length, we actually need the string, so we can write val to string, or we can just say e.target.value because this already is a string. So we can use any of this. This one, to be honest, would be faster because we wouldn't have to recalculate this. We already have access to this value, so we could just use this one. But for your easier understanding, I will leave it like this. And for the min, we have to say min to string dot length. And then we get how many characters are in the value that we typed in and how many characters are in the minimum that we set for this particular input field. So for this particular input field, we set the characters, the minimum characters are 4. So let's try if this would work. We have to write the logic. So if the value that we typed, the length of this, so the characters that we type are the same length as minimum length, and the value that we typed is smaller than minimum, only then we want to set it to 1872. Let's try. So if I type 1, I have to first save it. So if I type 1, it doesn't do anything because the value length is 1, but minimum length is 4. So it's waiting. So 19, 53. It's okay. This value has now 4 characters, but it's not smaller than minimum, which is 1872. But what if we try to type a smaller one? So 1745. So when we type the 4th character, it checked if that number, so 14 something, was smaller than what we set as a minimum. And because it was, then it set the minimum to 1872. So when we type a number that is smaller than minimum, but amount of characters is still smaller than 4, for example, in this case, and we leave the field, we don't want this to stay at 65. While we're typing, we want to allow user to type 4 characters, and only then we do the check. But if they leave the field before they reach 4 characters, we want also to reset this to either 0 or empty or minimum. So how do we do this? There is an event listener where we can say input on mouse leave and it's literally checking when the mouse will leave the field. So when this leaves, and then it will trigger this function that we will define below. So function on mouse leave, params will be the same, just that we don't need the max. We just need those three. And then we only need to know what is the value that is in the field. So when we leave the field, we want to know what was the last value typed in. And then we say, we only have if the value, we don't need the length, we just need to know if the value that is currently in the field is smaller than the minimum, then we want to reset it to minimum. So let's see. Poof, yes, it works. I have to say that when I'm thinking a little bit, I think this would be a better solution. When we are typing and the number is not big enough, when we leave, I would rather see that it just resets it to empty. And maybe also, if you're typing the number that is too big, okay, we can have it set to max. But if you're typing a number that is too small, I don't like the fact that it sets it to the minimum. I would rather see that it sets it just to the empty string. So the decision is yours, of course. However you want to define your component, you can check around how do some input fields in forms work, and whatever you like, you define it. So you just can see what kind of possibilities there are, but the user experience can be defined by the developer themselves. So for example, if we are now typing a smaller number, it just, if it's too big, it sets it to max. If it's too small, it just says, this is not okay, empty, try again. We can also do the same for max. So if it reaches over the max, it can just reset it to nothing until you type the right number. Maybe that's even better, I don't know. So let's maybe leave it like that. Okay, one last fun fact. For example, we added now on key up and we added on mouse leave event listeners. So if we type some number and leave, and the number was smaller than minimum, then the number will disappear. If the number is bigger or bigger than minimum and smaller than maximum, then it will stay, which is okay. But for example, what if we click here, make the input field in focus, but then leave the mouse, type a number, and then we're out, but the number will stay. So we can add another little event listener here, which is called on blur, which means when the input is not in focus anymore, we can also trigger a certain function. So let's add this. So input on blur will trigger handle on blur. And then what we want to happen when we handle on blur, it's literally the same as handle on mouse leave. So let's see if this would work. We type the number, we leave, this triggered on mouse leave. But if we click here, go away, type something, and then click out, then basically the element is not in focus anymore and on blur function is triggered. So because the functions are literally the same, we can just rename it handle on mouse leave and blur. And then we, in both situations, just call this function. So if input on mouse leave, then we call this function, or if input on blur, we call this function. And we don't need max, we said, we just need the min. So yeah,